Welcome to the podcast. My name is Chris Hall, your host, and today I've got a returning guest, Dr. Theresa Bullard. Dr. Theresa Bullard is a PhD physicist, a mystery school teacher, and a very unique lady that's able to marry together the mysteries of the universe and also science. And for those of you that don't know, we've actually recorded a podcast previously before, and it was called Where Quantum Physics Meets Mystery. So for those of you that want to check that out, I really encourage you to go to that episode on either YouTube, Spotify, wherever you want. And today we're going to talk about the power of archetypes. And I'll tell you a little personal story here. I just made Theresa laugh because when I said, let's talk about archetypes today, and she just said, oh, funny that, I'm just recording that right now on Gaia. So that's a lovely example of serendipity. So Theresa, it's wonderful to have you on the podcast again here today. So welcome, and I'm thoroughly looking forward to a conversation.
Thank you, Chris. Likewise, it's great to be back.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I'm sure you're about to blow my mind and probably heart open. So let's go into it. I know that from watching some of your things on Gaia in particular in the past, that you've spoken about Kabbalistic teachings and the tree of life. And within Kabbalah, it's and this tree of life concept, there are these different nodes that are on the tree of life. And for those of you that don't know that, Google it and check out the image and you'll see some things. And one of the ideas of the tree of life, from my understanding, but I want to connect with you on this, is that the tree of life somewhat represents some of the archetypes that exist in the universe, in life. Now, I really want to unpack that and go into the detail of that, but just for the benefit of everyone listening and watching, can I ask you a basic open question first of all? What are archetypes?
Yeah, so it's a good question because a lot of people often have that question. We sometimes use this term archetypes and not everybody knows what it means. So archetypes are the common patterns, characters, themes that we see show up again and again and again throughout history in our storytelling and also in our lives, right? So I would say that they're a universal pattern that's out there somewhere in the universe that influences us. So the things that the dynamics that play out in our lives, the types of people that show up in the world, the stories, for example, there's always characters of the mother and the maiden and the king and the hero and the villain. And, these are archetypal characters, but then there's also the themes of the journey of birth and life and death and renewal. There's the good versus evil theme. There's, the hero's journey of coming into, sort of coming into our maturity and our wisdom and our growth. So there's these different types of themes that we see in some of the greatest movies and the greatest movies of all time and books. Also, you think of like some of the best heroes' journeys are like the Star Wars, the original ones, and Lord of the Rings, and we have these that you go from this sort of naive or young kind of enthusiastic, but maybe just comfortable in your way of life, and then some big sudden change comes, and then you're off on an adventure, and through that adventure you grow and you become wise and you meet different teachers along the way. So these are archetypes, and they influence our own lives. They influence the way we show up in the world, and they also influence our subconscious. So our dreams will often have these archetypal characters playing out in them. Sometimes our dreams are just what we watched on TV that night, but other times our dreams go deeper, and these archetypal characters will come through, and they're trying to deliver messages to us. So I would say that these archetypes, sometimes people say, oh, it's just a concept, but an archetype isn't just a concept. An archetype has a consciousness to it. It's kind of like a being in a higher spiritual plane. And like the old gods and goddesses of the pantheons or the angelic host, or, these are archetypes, and they do work with us, and we can connect to them. And yet they also very much influence our lives and the themes that we're playing out here in our lives.
Oh gosh, absolutely. And so what's interesting is that there's so many things that you can unpack and look at. And one of them is how does it link to psychology, right? So if you look at someone like Carl Jung, I think he was a Swiss guy. He lived in Switzerland from memory, and he was a master at religion and mythology And he'd
Mm.
look at all these images throughout the ages over, thousands and thousands of years, and he would pick out the commonalities between different cultures. And from a Jungian point of view, in the psychological perspective, it's the idea that you've got your conscious mind and then you've got the unconscious. And so then, you can break that down even further and say you've got the personal unconscious, which is maybe, depending on what psychologists you talk about, it's the idea of like, these are maybe some of the suppressed things that you've had in your life, some forgotten memories, some all that jazz that's your personal unconscious. You're not aware of it, but it's there. And then you've got the common unconscious, right? And this is the idea of universality here. And so Jung, posited that the archetypes sit in the collective unconscious is the term. So that's the idea of psychology, and I find that fascinating. And he had one of his students, Eric Newman, and his analogy from a psychological point of view is that archetypes are the organs of the mind. I love that, the organs of the mind. So you can't see them like your heart or your lung, but they're there, right? And so then it's kind of like the deep question of, well, what on earth are they? Because you can't touch them, right? So are they beings, consciousness? Are they memories that get passed on between generations? Are they all of the above?
Yeah,
It kind of gives
those
me
are good
goosebumps to think,
questions.
what is this? Like fundamentally, what is it?
Yeah.
So I mean, from your point of view, like, what do you think? Because I know that every single, should we say, art and science has its point of view. So psychology will put it in a psychological lens. But what's your point of view as a spiritual teacher? Do you see archetypes as are they literally beings with energy? Are they their own separate thing that influence us? What are they?
This is a great question. So I would take two different approaches to it. On one hand, there's a spiritual approach, and in Hermetic teachings, for example, in the ancient Hermetic tradition, they say the all is mind. So when you say the archetypes are the organs of the mind, it makes me think of, oh, well, the all is mind, which is a Hermetic principle, and it says that the one mind, this all, creates everything through thought. And one of the teachings that we have in the mystery school tradition says that form is defined by purpose. So purpose defines form. So purpose, in our modern day language, we can maybe say, well, okay, there's intent. And so that mind of the all has an intent or has a purpose that it wants to accomplish. And then that then gets projected out, maybe through the tree of life or through various arrays of creation, that gets projected out. And then that purpose maybe divides itself up, and you get different aspects of that one purpose. You can think of a puzzle, right? So the big purpose is the puzzle, and then you have different pieces of the puzzle. And so each of those different pieces is like a different emanation or a different ray or different aspect of the tree of life. And then those individual pieces also have their piece of that greater purpose. They have a sub-purpose. And then that sub-purpose defines the form of the consciousness of the one mind, and that becomes the archetype. So that would be one aspect that I would say, okay, yeah, there's the purpose is what defines the form. So every archetype, and I would say that the archangels, the various gods and goddesses, all of these were embodiments of these archetypes. Even the major arcana of tarot, which was derived from Hermetic teachings, ancient Egyptian teachings. It's not Kabbalistic, but it can be related to the tree of life.
Yes.
They are also embodying, those 22 of the major arcana are embodying these archetypes as well. So there are different ways of showing us the same universal energies. So that would be my metaphysical interpretation of what are archetypes. But I also have a scientific interpretation of what are archetypes. So in my mystery teaching series in season 1, I talk about this idea of a holographic model, that we here in the physical, what we call the physical reality, is really a hologram, and that somewhere beyond, at a higher dimensional level, there is the origin of where the hologram is being projected from. And our true self, our eternal being, is there. And we are like a mirage, or like a holographic projection of that being. But the archetypes are there too. And so they're in this sort of beyond the hologram, higher dimensional space. And they become, as source energy sort of, this coherent energy comes from the source, it sort of bounces off of them and gets projected into the hologram, which then manifests our world. But from quantum physics perspective, where is that holographic encoding? So for those who don't know what a hologram is, we all know that we have these sort of playing cards, or we have the little hologram on the credit card, and you can kind of move it around a little bit in the light and you see a three-dimensional image in it. But the defining feature of the hologram is if you break that up and then you shine a light on any little piece of it, you'll see the whole image still. And there's a particular way that this is encoded, where you have to have a coherent light. It goes through a mirror, it splits, and then one part of that ray goes and bounces off an object, and then that reflects. The other part of the ray goes straight forward, and then they re-intersect. And when they re-intersect, that gets encoded or imprinted onto this holographic substrate. And so in quantum physics, that holographic substrate is actually the quantum zero-point field. It's like there's these ripples of energy that come up from the quantum sea, and those create waves. And as those waves intersect, that becomes the pattern that then the light shines through, and it manifests the physical world on the other side.
I love it. I love it. So one of the principles I think in, you can help me here. Is it in quantum physics that like attracts like? Is that one of the principles? Is that quantum? Or is
that would be the principle of vibration in Hermetic teachings.
Thank you. Okay, so vibration, Hermetic principles, like attracts like. So there's that element of things. And then what I want to say is that I have this deep intuition, and I can visualize it, that there are patterns, energetic patterns, and I can see them in my mind, whether it's a swirl or a curl or whatever, and they all represent different types of energy. And so when you put yourself amongst that, yes, like attracts like, but I also think that you can somewhat invoke these types of energies and sort of put yourself towards them, and it's almost like you become them because you're around them or invoking them, etc. So when you say the hologram,
we call that sympathetic resonance. That you
thank you.
It train yourself into that energy and vibration, and then you can attract.
Isn't that amazing? It exists. They've already got scientific terms, right? Perfect. So sympathetic energy. So you put yourself amongst that, you become it. And then when I think about the image of the hologram, well, that actually makes sense. So if you are consciousness shining on through a hologram through a pattern, the hologram is essentially a pattern. Therefore, if you're going to manifest that archetype through the pattern, through the holographic, type of energy, through the archetypal energy. So if that's the Great Father, you manifest that. If that's there are all sorts of archetypes as well. There's also like I've heard of the archetype of aggression, right? So if you manifest that, then all of a sudden, whoa, what's going through that hologram? It's aggression, and there's all different variants. So that's fascinating to me. And let's talk about the idea of possession. So I'm not going like, don't worry, people, I'm not going like demonic here or anything, because people think of like The Exorcist and little girl's head turning around when you think about possession. But check this out. So you got Venus, the goddess of love, right? Now, when you fall in love with someone, are you really in control? Ooh, right. So it's like that you are possessed.
Something takes over you. Yeah.
Something comes over you. You're just like, you can't handle. You like butterflies. Oh my God, I love her. I love him. Like I'm just absolutely besotted. And so, gosh, here's an interesting idea. Are we really in control of our lives? Or are the archetypes in those moments possessing us?
I think there's a back and forth dynamic. I think that the archetypes are, maybe if we want to use a lighter term, influencing, right? They're playing out through us. Yeah. So they are influenced, but the reason they can do that is that all 22 archetypes are a part of us already. Their patterns inform our pattern. So it's almost like they're like the language, or they're the alphabet that creates the language, and we are sentences and paragraphs, but we're made of that language. And so they're all in us, and so they can get activated, they can express through us, and sometimes yes, they can take over, but only if we agree to it, right? Because we have our own will. Nice. And so we have to agree to, we have to want to go into that energy. There's got to be something usually about that energy that's like attracts us, and so we invoke it. Consciously or unconsciously, we invoke it, and we then allow it to express itself through us. And that is that sympathetic resonance. Maybe inside of me, there's a part of me that is wanting to do that, or there's a part of me that, sometimes is our shadow side. Our shadow side is like the parts of us that we have not accepted about ourselves, and therefore we suppress it, and then we judge it, and then we project it onto others. But at some point our shadow side comes up and out through us, and it will take over if we don't come to terms with it and learn to shine light into the shadow.
Oh my God, exactly. And to me, self-realization is about being able to bring all these different types of archetypes into your life, into your world, including, and this is a psychological concept as well, the integration of the shadow self, of the dark side of self, right? So like, so lovely. I love that distinction about we have to allow them in. We have to like will, to, if we allowed ourselves to be possessed, then, well, not really. It's like we've chosen that, So using free will, we've chosen that. Let me do a little analogy here to being a teenager. So I remember being a teenager boy, and testosterone kicks in, and I remember my first times where I would lose my shit, and I'd get aggressive because it was all flowing through the system, whatever. Now, some people might say that's hormonal. Yeah, maybe. And yes, you've got free will, but I also think when something is a new force in your life, it has maybe more potential to overpower you. So yes, you have free will and all of this, but if it's a new thing, especially, we can get overtaken by it. So there's that. And there's also the idea of balance to me. Like, so if you're out of balance, if you haven't got all of these things kind of lined up, then what do you think about, like, if your well-being's low, for example, are you more vulnerable to being taken over, or, because your will is less strong, so to speak, by aggression or by anger or by the shadow self? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, when our tolerance is down or our energy is down, we tend to express more of our shadow. It's like it does tend to come out more from that level of the unconscious. And it's a combination of things there when it's a new expression for us. And it can, if it's like, imagine you have a tiger that's been caged up inside of you, and it's it's always remained caged, but it's meant to be out roaming and hunting and do, its natural instinct is to do a certain thing, and then it's been caged, so it's sort of anxious and it really wants to get out, and at some point you open up that gate, it's going to come out with a lot of force. So that could be that point of it taking over, but you still are the one who let it out. But you have to let it out in order to achieve that balance. Ultimately, it's like, until you recognize, oh, I've got this caged tiger in here, and I think this is a part of my power, and yet I haven't been willing to own it because I've been afraid of it, and now I need to let it out, and I need to express this so that I can learn how to master this energy within myself and bring it into integration and balance.
I love it. And I think exercise and working out has got a place here. So for example, when I go to the gym, and this applies to men and women, there's something for me about pumping the weights or going for a run, like getting it out. You get that tiger out, because it's a way for it to express itself healthily. And also I feel like it's a way where you've allowed it to express itself, but then you can channel that determination for the rest of the day in an integrated manner.
Yeah. And really it is a powerful force, right? So we don't want to keep ourselves weak. Actually, this exact topic in the tarot is embodied in the strength card, that we've got this lion inside of us that needs to be tamed, and it's sort of that animal nature, and it's that get up and go kind of force energy and aggression. But then the other imagery in the card is this beautiful, graceful woman who's just loving the lion and taming it through love, versus through trying to just be in this overly self-control or overly self-denial. And so there's an art to how we achieve that strength and that balance within ourselves, and develop a good relationship with these aspects of the self.
So the symbology in things like tarot, and also religious things and mythological things, the symbolism tells us perhaps how we can balance things out. And I saw a wonderful demonstration of someone overlaying, you mentioned this before, overlaying the tarot on the Kabbalah tree of life. So, there's all different types of wisdom telling us very similar stories, if not somewhat the same in some areas. I actually want to mention symbolism here for a second. So you've got sort of two things. You've got signs in the world, and signs are like, stop, do this. It's like, it's very explicit, right? Signs are one thing, and I mean literally a sign of something. Whereas a symbol is alluding to, it's speaking to this knowingness that you have, that you can't always put into words, but it's reflecting the wisdom of the archetype, right? And I feel like symbols are almost something that, imagine if my microphone in the middle here is the archetype. You can have symbols all around it, right? And the symbols kind of shine that slightly different light to say, what's strength in this story? What does it look like here? How do we bring balance? And that's what a great movie or a great book, or indeed a great mythological tradition teaches us. It's that there's so many different points of view that you can have symbologically to realize the archetype within your life. Like, what do you think about symbols and the place of them?
Yeah, I just read a quote recently that said that symbols are like mirrors. So the archetype is the source of the light, and the symbol's like a mirror that reflects that light to us from a different angle. Kind of like how the moon is just a mirror reflecting the light of the sun to us. So the symbols are a way in which the light is reflected into our subconscious, or our personal unconscious. Like it is the language that our unconscious understands and speaks in, right? So all your dreams are always in imagery and symbols and so forth. So this is the language that the unconscious really understands, and that we can use it as a link to connect to the universe and universal mind. So when we are consciously working with symbols, we are now speaking the language that our unconscious understands. And so we can consciously work with those symbols to implant seeds or ideas into the unconscious, and then the unconscious will work with the archetypal energies, draw it in, and then that flows it into our life to manifest it. And the other thing that in terms of symbols in Kabbalah, we talk about there's 3 basic building blocks. There's what we call numbers, which you could say is mathematics, but it's really numerology and numbers themselves, and those numbers are archetypes, but they're like the most fundamental. It's like the frequency of that archetype.
Yep.
And then you have letters, which are a little bit more complex than numbers. So behind a letter is a number. And so a number has a frequency, but it's a little more complex of a pattern. And then you have sounds, which is the utterance or the expression of that number and that letter. And we know from cymatics that when sound is impressed upon matter, like water or sand or anything like that, it creates a sacred geometric pattern.
It does, yeah.
So these symbols, which are sacred geometries often, or they could be other images, but most of these images have a number behind them. They have a letter associated with them. They have a sound associated with them. They have a sacred geometry associated with them. And then all of that kind of comes together. All these different mirrors or symbolic ways of reflecting the same energy come together. And yet they're all just showing us how to, almost like, okay, we get a little perspective here, we get a little perspective here, and then somewhere in the middle, they're all showing us the higher dimensional form that it represents.
Oh, wow. Okay. So with the cymatics there, you helped me make that connection between, I knew of it in terms of the resonance of things and the symbols that they create, but you've helped me connect something in my mind, which is the fundamentals of numerology, alphabet, and then that to symbology. And then, and this is where you can give yourself goosebumps and go like, the power of your word. And if you use Christian language, for example, in the beginning, there was the word,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, this is where mystery does start to meet science. And it is symbological that we can't quite explain that, but it's there, right? You've managed to describe that beautifully, but why that is the case, who knows? It's a metaphysical question, right?
Yeah. But it's interesting. I mean, Carl Jung, who you mentioned already, had a lot of letters that he wrote back and forth with Wolfgang Pauli, who was one of the founding fathers of quantum physics. Pauli had been, in a way, a client of Jung, or not directly, but he was referred to somebody else to work with. But they exchanged a lot of letters back and forth, and they both had this mission to identify how can we solve what they called the mind-body problem, which is, okay, we've got this mind and this conscious and collective unconscious and all of this, and we know that this actually is primary to matter. But then we have this very physical world, And this physical world is based on rules and laws and, physics and mathematics. And how can we link them so that we can understand how they're all part of the same whole? And so Jung's language was archetypes. Like, he talked about it all being about archetypes. But Pauli came in from this physics perspective, saying archetypes are symbols, and symbols often have geometry associated with them, and geometry is based on math. And so mathematics and numbers and, geometry, like, these are the more fundamental language where it's universal, that we can, kind of connect the two, the mind and the body, the physical and the spiritual together.
Right. So, I practice yoga, so I'm not going mad when I chant a certain thing like Om or whatever. There's a resonance to it that brings healing. That's why they say universal healing sound.
Yeah.
Probably true. I mean, I do it and I feel good. So it's probably true, right? You can feel these things in your life. Okay, so I want to talk about the idea of integration here for a second. So let's talk about the shadow self, the the negative sides of us and all that stuff. All right, let's do. You've got, within each archetype, is it true that there tends to be the shadow and the light version? I.e., for example, you've got the benevolent mother, the mother that is benevolent, and you've got the overbearing mother. So that comes up in a lot of Disney movies, where the evil mother that wants to control the children and keep them in my house and castle forever, and like doesn't harm because and the benevolent one is truly nurturing, and kind and feminine, but there's different versions of femininity, actually. So what's that about? Like, are we meant to kind of realize that negative form exists, and do we try to, what do we do with that? Do we try and get rid of it once we realize it, or how do we integrate? What do we do?
So we talk about it being about the balanced and the pure expression versus a distorted expression. So we have for example, the mother, since you brought that example up, the mother would be, nurturing. She would be the womb of creation. She would be what gives form to things. So she has a function and a role, and nurturing and loving and so forth, all accepting, right? And that's the balanced and pure expression. But if you go, it's every energy, every vibrational energy is a spectrum, right? And this is where Hermetic teachings come in, where we have this principle of polarity and vibration. And so there's a spectrum, and, what is good and what is bad is really relative to where you on the spectrum. And you're going to think of, okay, well, someone who's not as loving as I am is therefore not a good mother, or, we get into these judgments about it. So what we say is that the balanced expression is actually the middle of the spectrum. And if you go to too much or too little, right? So in the mother, you could go smothering, right? The mother who smothers because she loves so much and she wants to do everything for you, but then she ends up stifling the child's individuality.
Right.
So that's overbearing, but not from an evil place, but from a I love you so much place, right?
Yeah.
And then you have not enough, like nurturing and love, and you get into neglectfulness, and you get into the sort of the evil stepmother side of it, and those are distortions of the mother energy. So what we want to do is figure out where are we on the spectrum, and then we have to realize that we just have to shift vibration on the quality of that energy to find the balance point. So until we find the balance point, usually the pendulum is swinging back and forth to too much, not enough, too much, not enough, too much, not enough, until we find where's the balance. So within each archetype is going to have this spectrum to it. They all have their strengths and their weaknesses, their vices and their virtues, their positive expressions and their negative expressions. And, so when you mentioned aggression earlier, I thought, well, that's really just a distortion of the, kind of the Mars energy, right? Okay. The Mars is masculinity, it's initiative, it's force, it's, get up and go kind of energy. And we all need that. But if it goes too much, it becomes aggressive. If it goes not enough, it becomes, like you're not really getting shit done.
You're a pushover. So like exactly. If you don't have enough Mars energy, for example, then you can not have enough assertion in your life, right? Exactly. And therefore you get trampled on. Right. Gosh, that's interesting. So it's all about walking the line in the middle.
It is, exactly. And in Kabbalah, we talk about this too. You know, you have these two pillars, which we call the pillars of polarity. One is about force, the other is about form. And then we have the middle pillar. And we're needing to walk all parts of that tree to understand them and bring them into balance within themselves. But then we also have to bring them into balance with their polarity side so that we can find the middle way, or the middle pillar. And the other thing about the shadow that I will say is that it's not just the bad parts, right? So sometimes the shadow is gifts about ourselves that we've not recognized or acknowledged. And so we say, well, you know, we get this story in our head. Well, I'm not funny enough, or I'm not pretty enough, or I'm not this enough, and yet we are, but we're not acknowledging it. So it gets you know, pushed down into our shadow side. And so the shadow is all of the crap that's overlaying the gift. And then as we peel the layers away, and we actually look at the shadow and peel those layers away, it reveals the gift in time, and we can reclaim those parts of ourselves that we've rejected, either because it wasn't acceptable, or wasn't culturally, you know, aligned, or religiously aligned. You know, we've rejected parts of ourselves.
I think about getting drunk there. And what I mean is, like, I'm a confident person, but the reason I bring that up is there are plenty of people that we probably all know where when they have a drink, they're bloody hilarious. They're confident. They're this, they're that. And it might sound like a cliche, but actually, you know, maybe they're not expressing that, you know, the jester inside of them that actually exists, and they should be confident and should be funny, because they are. It's just they haven't embraced that side. So
haven't loosened up enough to, you know, they're too insecure. So their insecurities are keeping them into this control and perfectionism and whatnot, right?
Exactly. So, gosh, you've also really helped me understand the idea of the two pillars and the middle pillar there as well, which that, thank you for that. That's quite fundamental. Right. And then what's also interesting to me is if we go too far, then we can, I need to credit Jordan Peterson here, the psychologist. I watched a video last night on this, and he said, if you allow, for example, if you're a soldier and you go too far towards aggression, you let out that beast so much that you do so many horrific things in war, because that is needed for your survival or whatever. So you let that beast out fully.
Yeah.
But when you let the shadow archetype out to such an extreme, it enables yourself, your being, to do horrendous things. And therefore, when you come back to civil society, you're traumatized by that. And he says, is that an idea of, you know, if you allow something to express itself too much, you've traumatized yourself, and therefore you're out of balance. And again, it comes back down to the two pillars in the middle. So, you know, is there a warning sign here in terms of, you know, if we go too extreme to the shadow self, then we become traumatized?
Warning sign. Well, that really depends on you knowing yourself, I think.
Okay,
And,
good point.
you know, if you know yourself, then you will know where your balance is and your normal is, and you'll know when you're getting too far one way or too far another way.
Yep.
So that's why the mystery traditions have always said, you know thyself. That is like the ultimate knowledge that you can have, is knowledge of self. And so most people, unfortunately, don't know themselves, and so they can more easily get caught up in the shadow sides, and it can overtake, and yeah, it can do damaging things, because it's like it wasn't really them. That was where the archetype was overtaking, but in a negative, you know, in a shadow side or an extreme way. Almost all the archetypes can be kind of one-sided, you know, they can be kind of extreme in their own being, right? And that's why we as humans are composite of many archetypes, because the archetypes need to balance each other out. So if one of them like just comes up super strong, but the other side isn't strong enough to balance that and temper that, then, you know, it's there again, it's in a state of imbalance. And so, you know, if you look at love and mercy and compassion versus power and aggression and severity, these two, you can be having a good sense of your power, but if you don't have a good sense of compassion and love and altruism to balance that out, then it's very likely that it's going to get, you know, too cruel in some ways. So we have to have both sides, you know, we have to have all of it kind of coming in to balance each other out.
So it's actually self-realization is a link to maturity, really, isn't it? And maturity is not just to do with age. That's a misconception. Having said that, there are places where people can be vulnerable to be indoctrinated to a more extreme version. So, you know, with men and women that join the army at 18, there is a risk that they become indoctrinated towards a more extreme version of aggression. And that's statistically, should we say, more likely because they've had less time in their life to go down the realization path of understanding thyself. So, you know, I appreciate what everyone does in the military. So it's not about knocking that. It's just about saying, you know, be aware that if you're less mature in your own realization, then you may be more susceptible to indoctrination of one form or another. And I think that kind of, we can either allow that to happen ourselves or others do it to us willingly, which is a shame. But when you become...
This happens, if I can, this happens in religion, this happens in education, this happens in culture. I mean, all of that is indoctrination. You know, from the moment that we're growing up, we're learning, but we're also being indoctrinated into these different ways of thinking and being. But you're right, you know, the younger we are, the more impressionable we are, the less we know ourselves.
Yep.
And it, you know, in our world today, the way we're set up, because we're not really, we don't have spiritual education. And I'm not talking religious, but I'm talking, you know, real spiritual education of know thyself and real life tools for how to deal with life, not just how to make a career, but how to deal with life that helps us mature. And those old rites of passage that we used to have in shamanic times and so forth, we don't have that anymore. And so we are maturing at later ages than we once did, because we're, you know, it's like we don't have the rites of passage to help accelerate that maturing process. And sometimes people can go to their grave and not know who they are, right? So it's not about age. You could also have really young people who do, they come in as those old souls and they just have a kind of a sense of connection to themselves and they don't buy into the indoctrination, right? And so hopefully if they have supportive parents, then they'll be, you know, protected in that. But if they don't have supportive, you know, infrastructure or family around them, then they might be an outcast, right? So we have all these things to deal with, but ultimately we have to take responsibility for the fact that we either bought into the indoctrination and disconnected with ourselves and what we knew to be true inside of us, or we rejected the indoctrination and stayed true to ourselves. And, you know, we all make that choice at some point along the way.
Right. Okay. So fundamentally for me, what I've got now 3 lightning bolts of connection in my mind, and they are maturity, self-realization, and walking the middle path. They all kind of come together, right? And you know, and that's really important. And you're so right to say that the risk of indoctrination exists when there's a lack of maturity, lack of self-realization, lack of walking the middle path in any area. Like I think back to my college, university days where I had a certain viewpoint of the world because I didn't have a bloody clue what life was about yet. You know, and then so I don't really hang. There are some university friends that I still get on with, and there's others I just don't talk to anymore because that was like a different phase of life where I was young and I didn't know. You know, and so it's in education, it's in, we mentioned the military, but that's not the only thing. It's in culture, you know, so it's even in, I don't want to go down to the politics road here, but it is in politics as well, because you've got the ideology. So the ideology is the representation and the fixed tradition of an idea. So I have the idea that I am this wing, that wing, and this is what's important to me in my politique. But really, it's an idea that you're holding on to. And it doesn't necessarily...
Belief systems, ideas,
Right?
You get it in science too. Science also indoctrinates you into a certain way of thinking and a certain way of being and behaving. And it's in every infrastructure that's based around some kind of belief system or idea.
It does. I feel like we're in an era of scientism, and scientism has a risk of being somewhat polluted by just the belief that that's the only way. And it doesn't allow for a conversation to say, well, wait a minute, 100 years ago, science thought this, and now that's proven to be radically wrong and bad for your health or this or that. You know, there's so many ways in which science evolves. And to me, science, yes, is so important, but it shouldn't become scientism to the extent where we can't ask a question.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and in our scientism type of era, it's all materialism as well. You know, it's gone more and more towards the material is all there is, and this mind stuff is just a epiphenomenon of neurons in your brain versus there actually being some reality beyond just the physical. So it's starting to shift again now that quantum physics is kind of opening the door up for this question again. But because of the indoctrination within the scientific way of thinking in that industry, it's majority materialism, and they don't want to talk about consciousness. So they just, as a belief system, they just dismiss it offhand, and they're very they get just as worked up about it as you would, Republicans and Democrats, or various religions kind of that see each other as opposed to each other. So it's this. I personally have always gravitated more towards the interdisciplinary way of like, let's see how we can connect the dots between all these different fields, versus just getting so myopic in one way of thinking.
Correct. I feel the same way passionately, that, I love the term holistic, in the sense of holistic to me does not mean living in California and going to yoga and having a green smoothie. Holistic means, bringing it all together, truly, you know what I mean? Like really bringing it all together, all the connected dots. And I think the scientism thing has linked to governmentism and corporatism as well. So it's kind of like there's some links there that people aren't always consciously admitting, but like there's a financial motive, there's what the government tells us we should do, and there's what the scientism says we should do. And there's a little kind of triangle between them. And therefore scientism and those things tend to defend themselves if someone just asks a question. So then it's not about the topic at hand. It's not about the question, the exploration. It's about the defense of the ideology of that thing that's trying to defend itself.
Yeah, I think there's 5 that I've heard talked about. And I don't know if I'll remember all 5 of them, but there's definitely government. There's definitely scientism. There's definitely money, right? And that financial industry. Education is another one.
Right.
And I'm trying to think of what the 5th one is, but it's another big, way in which we tend to get indoctrinated. Religion. Did we say religion already? Religion.
We didn't know, so it could.
So those are the 5, right? So religion, education, science, government, money. Those are the big ones that we get indoctrinated through. And we have to wade through our belief systems around those things and question them.
Mm-hmm. So this is not a tangent to me. This is actually a very, very wise point to say these are the dynamics of basically culture, right? And then walking the middle path is embracing all these different versions of archetypes so you can get to know yourself.
And breaking out of the matrix, right? So those 5 things, the cultural indoctrination creates our matrix. And getting to know thyself is about breaking out of the matrix and letting go of having to be bound by those restrictions and limitations and those do's and don'ts of, that matrix way of being, and break free from it so that you can really be yourself. And then from there, it's about getting to know the archetypes within you and balancing them out and finding that place of individuation.
Absolutely. Let's talk about values for a second. So one of the ideas of, say, Nietzsche, let's go back to psychology, when he said that God is dead, what one might have meant by that is that with the loss of popular religion, i.e. not everyone's a this or a that anymore, it has a loss of value system, and value system to me is something that guides us through life. So it's not that it has to be an ironclad way of doing things, but it's kind of the principles that we aspire to. So that's the idea of the Nietzscheism loss, God is dead thing, right? So if you've got the loss of religion and this and that, well, what about the archetypes and values? Because actually, when we walk the middle path, or when we try to realize the great father, the great mother, whatever it is that we're trying to realize, actually, do they give us a sense of value structure in life?
Yeah, for sure. But it's an internal compass at that point versus an external compass. And so, I would say that there are universal laws, spiritual laws, that the archetypes embody, and they're trying to help us learn from within. And so we learn to orient our compass towards what is aligned with that spiritual principle. So just as an example, golden rule is a spiritual law. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Treat everybody like divine beings and treat yourself like a divine being. We'll all get along. And karma, cause and effect, is another principle that even if it's not going to be the karmic return here in the physical, it will at some point come around, because there has to be this, there's always this energy that gets put out and is going to come back. And there's a maintaining of the energy neither being created nor destroyed, only transformed, and so forth. So there's certain principle energy exchange, right? Equal energy exchange, and maintaining a balance around things. These are principles that they're natural law, or they're spiritual law that's reflected in natural law. And we can learn them just by, testing the waters, and then by the fruits, by the results that we create as we test the waters, we'll know whether that created a good fruit, good result or not. And if it didn't create a good result, then I must have been out of alignment somehow with those natural laws and those spiritual laws. Or if I did something, but it didn't feel good or feel right within my soul, then I must be out of alignment with those spiritual laws. So we have to really assess both on the external as well as the internal results that get created, whether we're aligning with those core values. And they are universal.
Yeah, love that. Okay, so again, thank you, because you've like, what you've done there is the middle path to me is not just for the sake of knowing thyself. It's so that you can get onto a higher path of honoring a life that's aligned to spiritual law and universal law.
Yeah, it's about alignment for sure. It's about being one with that divine will and flowing 100% in alignment with it. And when we do, nothing stops us. It's like we will then be able to manifest a heaven on earth type experience, or the life of our dreams type of an experience. And this life will then become pure joy and bliss, and and impact, positive impact of fulfilling our missions. So
So values to me, 5 minutes ago, before we had this conversation, values to me were just a guiding principle that was somewhat subjective and important to me because I have these values, right? But now what they mean to me is they're the guiding compass internally that help us get onto something way more meaningful, which is universality of principles. Wow.
And there's new paradigm values coming in, right? So in my little book that I wrote called the Game Changers, 21st Century Alchemists, or Social Alchemists in the 21st Century, I talk about the value system needing to change, because we've gone from an old value system that was really programmed by the Newtonian way of thinking. And it was about, what's materially productive, what can we control, right? What creates that sort of survival of the fittest and sort of that competition, the competitive edge, right? We have these values that have really been informed by Newtonian way of thinking, which was determinism, separatism, materialism, and rationalism. So these four principles really informed a lot of our mindset over the last several hundred years. And now we're shifting out of that old paradigm into a new paradigm. And the new paradigm is saying, well, it's actually aligned more with quantum. It's like we're connected, we're not separate. We have consciousness. It's not all just materialism. There's uncertainty in things. You can't, determine everything. And some things are not always rational the way you might think of in the past. There's all kinds of context, that comes in. And so it's not just black and white anymore, it's contextual. So we have these different paradigms coming in. And then you also see with the cultural creatives and the millennials and some of those who are fueling the movement into the new paradigm, there's more sense of community. We want to connect with each other. We want to do our social responsibility and our personal, take personal responsibility for the impact that we're having, rather than just sort of leave it to somebody else to deal with. So there's really good values that are coming in. There's more like desire to go towards universal spirituality versus just dogma and religion. So there's a change in values that are happening right now, and that change in values is meant to propel us into a new paradigm way of life on earth. And yet you have the old paradigm values that are fighting for survival against the new paradigm that's coming in. And so this is a big part of where that big polarity that's happening in our world and the struggle that's happening in our world is happening right now.
Gosh, absolutely. And oh my God, wow. And let me make a comment on institutions and the tradition of culture here. So culture itself is a representation of, it's kind of two things actually. It's the traditions of the past, and the traditions of the past are ultimately dead. And so what I mean by that is then they're in the past. They're not here anymore, so to speak. And then you've got the livingness of culture, which I think is this, that we live, we breathe it, we experience it. And so as we transition between generations, it's about navigating what's important to us from the past, because some things are very good to carry on, and that's literally what conservatism is, right? But there are indeed these new paradigms kicking in. So then that becomes it's the living element of culture, isn't it? So it is about the past, but it's also about living it and transforming it into a new current epoch, so to speak.
Yeah. So I'm part of, the modern mystery school tradition. And within the mystery school tradition, we have an ancient tradition. It is a lineage. It has a certain way of doing things and so forth. And yet, to be a true mystery school, we can't get stale in the old way of doing things if that no longer applies to our world today. So we draw from that ancient wisdom, that's universal wisdom. We draw from the knowledge and the experience, the understanding of how to, create that transformational process within our lives, how to really come to greater self-mastery and so forth. We draw from all of that, but then we have to adapt it to today's world. Mm-hmm. And we have to always stay relevant and adaptable, because we're on an evolutionary path. We're on a path of progression. We're not on a path of always trying to stay the same. And so it's about drawing the wisdom of the past and letting it inform our now and our future, but making sure it's universal wisdom, not outdated wisdom, that it's always going to apply because it's just part of the universe, versus this is a dogma, it's an outmoded way of thinking, and that was human pollution that came in. So we're about, building the new world on the foundation of the ancient wisdom, and yet building the new paradigm on top of that in a way that's really symbiotic and harmoniously integrated together.
Wow. Okay. Well, listen, Theresa, I'm conscious of time because I want to honor, we put aside an hour for this, and that seems like a really good kind of high note to kind of conclude on. So you mentioned indeed the modern mystery school. So if people want to kind of get in touch, there's the modern mystery school in which you teach through. That is international. So it's got a big presence in North America, but it's also very much international. And you also mentioned your book. What was the name of the book you wrote?
So the book was The Game Changers, Social Alchemists in the 21st Century. And they can find that on Amazon. It's both in paperback as well as ebook. Mm-hmm. And then also they can check out my mystery teaching series on Gaia. So they can go to gaia.com/Theresa Bullard, or they can go to mysteryteachings.com. Those are two links where they can find out a little bit more about that. We have just filmed for season 4, which is going to be exactly on this topic of archetypes and the hero's journey, and going through what are all those 22 archetypes and how do we relate to them, and looking at all those strengths and weaknesses. And it's going to be a really amazing season. And they can, of course, if they haven't seen any of it, there's 3 other seasons that work with the science and the metaphysics and blending it all together and bringing in some mystery school teachings and giving tools for people to apply in their own lives.
Absolutely. And that's how you and I met. I really encourage people to go right back to season 1 and start from the beginning. It's incredible. I watched you on Gaia there doing that, and we'll put some links in the show notes below. And then finally, what about websites? Where can people follow your work online, social media?
Yes, so me personally, if they go to theresabullard.com, that's my personal website. They can sign up for my newsletter to get, articles and sort of announcements about video blogs or this various, events that we're running. And then I am on Facebook. There is a new page, Dr. Theresa Bullard on Facebook. I'm also on Instagram, same kind of handle, Dr. Theresa Bullard, with just the DR and then the Theresa Bullard. And Theresa spelled with an H. So
fantastic. I mean, I could go on for hours and days with you. So,
This was a fun conversation. It was very, good, well thought out, a good topic and deep. Yep. And I hope it'll serve. So it's fun.
Absolutely. I really hope I'm sure we've whet a lot of people's appetite for those that are new to archetypes, and for those that are familiar with it. You've certainly rounded out so many areas of understanding for me. So thank you so much, Dr. Theresa Bullard, for coming on the podcast today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Chris.